Okay. All right, so tonight's presentation will be about financial aid, the process, the FAFSA application, the FSAID, what happens after FAFSA, a little bit about the verification process and why some things are required. All right, so in most cases, the financial aid process starts with the FAFSA application. Okay, it's a free application for federal student aid. And that's exactly what it is. It's a free form, so you never have to pay anyone to complete that form for you. If you need help, you can always reach out to any college. High school counselors and teachers have been receiving a lot of information about the FAFSA and can assist students and parents with completing that. Pay attention to any events that's being offered at your high school because they may have financial aid night or FAFSA nights where you can also get assistance. So the purpose of the FAFSA application is to help the financial aid offices determine how needy a family is and the type of aid that they could actually award out to each student to assist them with paying for their education. This is not a one-time type of application. You have to do this every single year. So every October 1st, the new FAFSA for the next academic year will be available. You won't create a new profile or anything because it'll populate what you've already done for the prior year. Then you're basically just going in and updating the information that you provided the year before. And the website where you would go is the https fafsa.ed.gov, or in most cases on any web browser, you can put in FAFSA, you can put in federal student aid, and it will populate. Just make sure it says .gov at the end of the web browser. Okay. All right, so this is the first page of the FAFSA application when you first log into fafsa.ed.gov. As you see here, there's a section where you can start the application as the student, or you can start the application as a parent. So if you start the application as a student, the student will have to sign in with their FSAID username and password. And we'll go into that a little more in detail throughout the presentation. But the student and at least one parent will have to create an FSAID. But only the student can start the application with the FSAID username and password. So parents, if they are starting a FAFSA application, they would have to sign in with their students' information, their identifying information. So they would need to know the student's name, date of birth, social security number as it appears on their social security card with the Social Security Administration, because that's how everything will be verified and checked throughout the FAFSA process behind the scenes. And that way they can confirm that you are the person that's actually completing the form and no one's trying to steal your identity. I also want to mention that new to Colorado as of October 1st of 2020 is something called the Caspa application. And it's the Colorado application for state financial aid. And this is available to students who may not be eligible to apply for financial aid through the FAFSA. So this would be considered our asset students, our undocumented students, non-US resident, citizen resident students, as well as international students. And this is the website where they would go to register. It's through the Colorado Department of Education, but once you submit the application, it will go to the colleges that has been selected on the Caspa application. So like the FAFSA, the Caspa also allows students to add up to 10 different colleges to receive that information. But Caspa is only for Colorado schools that are participating in the Colorado application for state financial aid. So how to apply for the Caspa? This is the login page. So you would not create a federal student aid ID and username because it's not a federal form. It's a state application. And so the student and the parent would create an account to gain access to this application. Then it'll ask you, because it wanted to make sure that you're not eligible to receive federal student aid. So it'll give you a couple of check and bound questions to make sure that you should not be completing the FAFSA and that you're eligible to complete the Caspa application. And a lot of the information that is required on the Caspa is the same that's required on the FAFSA. So tax information, household information. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like. And this is the, when you create your sign-in, just an idea, so you know that you're in the right place. All right, so with the FAFSA, which is the Federal Student Aid or Financial Aid, when you create your username and password, that creates your electronic signature. So that's why at least the student and at least one parent has to have an FSA ID, username, and password. This is how you would actually sign the FAFSA application. It's recommended that you create your FSA ID, username, and password before completing the FAFSA application because, again, there's things that has to happen in the background to make sure that you are okay to complete the FAFSA application and to submit that application. So you can go directly to the Federal Student Aid .ed.gov website to create your FSA ID, username, and password. So in a case where a parent or student, if the student cannot create a US FSA ID username or password, then they would have to complete the Caspa form. If the student can create an FSA ID username and password, they would complete the FAFSA. But if the parent does not have a valid Social Security number, then they can still complete the FAFSA, put in all zeros as the Social Security number. The student would go ahead and complete, the parent would complete their information. At the end, before the student would submit the application to the federal processor, they would print the signature page for the parent to sign, date, and mail to the federal processor. Then the student would submit their application. The only difference really between the electronic process and the paper signature is the timing. If they submit the application electronically, it takes about 3 to 5 days to process. If you have to mail in a paper signature, it could take 4 to 6 weeks to process. So you don't want to delay in getting that mailed in. And if you take longer than 10 days to submit that signature page, they may wipe out your application because now they're thinking maybe you're not interested in submitting the FAFSA application. So when submitting the FSAI username and password, again, the student and at least one parent will need to create it. You need to have a valid Social Security number, cell phone number, and an email account. This is because once you start to create your username and password, they want to, again, behind the scenes, verify that you are the person that should be completing the form. So they will send a code to your phone. They will also send a code to your email. You will have to put that on the FAFSA application to verify. So that's why you need to have a valid email address and cell phone that you have access to at that moment that you're completing the FAFSA, because they will send information directly to that as a prompt for you to submit on the FAFSA before you can submit it. So when creating the FSA ID, this is part of what it may look like. So if you create it, then you have to later go in and update something on your FAFSA and you can't remember what it is, you can go to that website again and click on Manage My FSA ID, and it will help you to locate your username and password. So that's why it's important to have a valid email address and cell phone number, because that could ease up the process. Also, when creating your FSA ID, you have to answer some challenge questions as well as create some challenge questions. Creating your FSA ID username and password is the hardest part, in my opinion, in the financial aid process, because it's very time consuming. It's very sensitive to the information that you're putting in. Don't put your name or anything like that into the username, because they don't want any identifying information in that. So you may have to create various different forms in order to get one that's appropriate for you to be able to use. Okay. So also when completing the Fafsa application or the Caspa application, it's going to require income and tax information. So for federal student aid purposes and the state purposes, there's something that's created called the prior year, or the PPY. And this is mainly where they are requesting 2 years prior tax information. So if you're applying for financial aid for the 2021-22 school year, where you will start school next fall of 2021, 2 years prior is 2019. So the Fafsa application will require 2019 tax information. Now you might be saying that, especially with COVID, that your circumstances have changed. Maybe one parent is not working or income has been reduced. It could be a death of a parent. So your household circumstances is not the same as it was from 2019. It could even be a circumstance where there's another baby in the house, so there's another kid that would need to be, that wasn't included on the tax return, but is now part of your household. So in that case, you still have to provide your 2019 tax information on the Fafsa application, receive your official award notice from the financial aid office. If that aid is not sufficient, then that's when you would reach out directly to the financial aid office at the college and say, I have a circumstance, I need additional funding. Depending on what those circumstances are, then the financial aid office will allow you to submit something called a professional judgment appeal. It can be an income adjustment. It could be an adjustment for medical expenses that's not being covered by insurance. It could be loss of income, case of divorce or separation. So therefore, there's no longer two household incomes and there's just one. But you still have to use your 2019 tax information first. Submit your FAFSA to the federal processor. Once you submit that FAFSA to the federal processor, all communication as it relates to financial aid is with the colleges. Okay? You receive your award notification. If the aid is not sufficient, then you would submit an appeal to the financial aid office. They will evaluate that to see if they can award additional aid out to you, additional need-based aid. And the goal is to be able to get the expected family contribution lowered so that there could be additional need-based aid awarded to you. So the financial aid administrators have the authority by the U.S. Department of Education to go in and make those adjustments to your FAFSA. Okay? They would collect an appeal form where you would write a personal statement indicating what your circumstances are, and they would try to evaluate what your current circumstances would be for 2021 and make those adjustments to your FAFSA if it would make a difference as far as the aid is concerned. So anytime you have a hardship or even after school has started and something happens, reach out to the financial aid office, let them know what's going on so they can determine whether there's any adjustments that they can make to help students become more aid eligible. So there are some circumstances where a student may not be able to provide parent information on the FAFSA. So for federal student aid purposes, all students are considered dependent on their parents up until the age of 24. The only circumstances that could deem them not having to provide parent income and information is if they meet any of the following criteria. So if they're born before January 1st, 1998, meaning they're 24, they're married at the time that they submit the FAFSA, if the student is in the armed forces, if the student have their own dependents or children that they provide more than 50% of the support for, then they could be considered independent. Not that their parents are helping to provide support for their child, but the student themselves is caring for their own child. If the student is an orphan in foster care or a dependent through the courts, meaning that they were removed from their home for their own safety, then they could be considered an independent student. If the student is an emancipated minor in a legal guardianship, So legal guardianship, meaning that they're in the care of someone else. They have not been legally adopted, but it's part of a legal guardianship. So for the FAFSA and financial aid purposes, the biological parent and an adoptive parent are the only parents that can provide information on the FAFSA. So the biological parent or an adoptive parent can only provide their information on the FAFSA. So if the student was raised by their grandparents, but that grandparent did not legally adopt that child, they're just in the legal guardianship, that grandparent cannot provide their information on the FAFSA. It has to be a biological parent or a parent that has adopted that child. There are some circumstances where the student could be unaccompanied or at risk of being homeless, meaning they're living away from their parents, they're sleeping on their best friend's couch, sleeping in their car, under a bridge, at a youth center, any type of place like that, then the high school or that agency that they're working with can confirm and verify that they're at a homeless or at-risk situation and can deem that student independent. Therefore, parent information does not have to be required on the form. And then there may be some other circumstances in case of where both parents are deceased, student don't know where the parents are, parent is incarcerated, then those are circumstances where a student could apply for independency status as well. So on the FAFSA, it will ask these questions. If the student answers yes to any of these questions, then it will flag your FAFSA and reject it. The financial aid office will receive it and see that the student is applying as an independent student, then they will reach out for the student to provide additional documentation to support that dependency status. So that would be a personal statement. It could be from the high school's and McKinley-Vento form that's signed by the designated person at the high school. Each high school has one person that can certify that form. They would also have to provide, with that personal statement, documentation to support what their situation is. That could be if there's court documents, newspaper clippings, obituaries, any type of documentation that can support that. A letter from a third party on their letterhead, a clergy, just anyone that knows your circumstances. As a last resort, the student could use information from a family member or a friend who knows their circumstances. That has to be reviewed and approved by the financial aid office, and if approved, then they will go ahead and resubmit your FAFSA indicating that you're an independent student and parent information will not be required. You will have to recertify that status every single year. So if you do submit any type of appeal, keep that documentation in a safe place because you may have to provide some of that same documentation again. And you just basically be updating your personal statement as it relates to what your current circumstances are at the time you submit that appeal. Okay. So when you complete the FAFSA application, there's something called the data retrieval tool, or the DRT. Both the student and the parent can utilize this tool if they have filed a 2019 federal tax return. The benefit of using the data retrieval tool through the FAFSA application is that it allows you to be able to access your information directly on the Internal Revenue Service website. Therefore, you're not having to try to figure out what number goes on which line. Okay? And then, therefore, it alleviates any errors or cause you to be selected for verification. And we'll talk a little more about verification later on. But to be able to access the data retrieval tool, you have to have a Fsid username and password and have a copy of your federal tax return in front of you, because once you start that process, it will pre-populate some information. And again, the student and the parent can do theirs separately. You would have to do it separately. And it will pre-populate some information, your name, your date of birth, your social security number, and your address. So, but the information is pre-populated, must match exactly the way it is on that federal tax return. If it does not, it will reject. It has to match so that it can find your tax information. so that they're pulling in the right tax information onto your FAFSA application. So in a case where parents are married but filed separately, you will not be able to use the data retrieval tool because it cannot pull in two different tax returns. Okay, so if you file jointly, then yes. The important things to remember about that is, for example, if your name is John Adam Smith, and on your tax return it says John Adam Smith, but on the data retrieval pre-populated information it says John A. Smith, you need to change it to Adam because it has to match exactly the way it is on that tax return in order to find your information. Same thing with your address, 123 Elm Street. Well, let's say South Elm Street. And you spell out the word South on the tax return, but it pre-populates just an S. You got to put in the word South, exactly the way it is on the tax return. Same thing with street and avenue. If there's an apartment, do not write in the word apartment, just put the number or the letters that's associated with that. No commas, dashes, periods, anything like that, or it will reject. Okay? So if you guys have any, if you're trying to use the data retrieval tool and you're having problems, feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to help you through the process. There was something else I wanted to mention about that. So there are circumstances where you may not be able to use the data retrieval tool. So in that case, then you just have to manually input the information. And again, the benefit of using the data retrieval tool, if you've been selected for verification by the federal processor, being selected for verification means that they're requiring that you provide additional information to the financial aid office. Then the financial aid office is charged with reviewing that information, collecting it and reviewing and confirming that what you put on the FAFSA matches those documents. If it does not match, the financial aid office will then go in and adjust that information based off of the verifying documents that you provided, resubmit the FAFSA to be reevaluated. They'll get it back in the financial aid office, and then we'll be able to award off of that. So it's very important that you put in the most accurate information on your FAFSA, because if you're selected for verification, verifying documents will be collected and will correct any information that's not correct on the FAFSA application, and your application will be reprocessed. Okay? So with the FAFSA application, this is the various different types of awards that are determined to help you with financial aid. So there's federal grants that's available. So the Pell Grant is entitled aid. So if the student meets the need-based criteria and they're enrolled, at least have time, they will be eligible to receive the Pell Grant. I know for 2021, the Pell Grant for an academic year is going to be about $6,500, and the expected family contribution, which is the EFC and what the federal government considers families to be able to contribute towards their child's education. If that number is below, I want to say $5,900, then the student would be eligible for some form of Pell Grant and need-based aid. That will be, in the additional need-based aid will be awarded at the colleges. Okay, the federal FAFSA determines eligibility for the SELG grant. That goes to the neediest students. So it goes out to those students that have a 0 EFC first. The schools don't get very much of that money, so it runs out very quickly. So it's not entitled aid. The TEACH grant is a grant that's available for students that are interested in teaching. So they can get up to $4,000 in academic year. So in a 4-year time span, that's $16,000 in grant money, in addition to the Pell Grant that a student can receive. But there's stipulations tied to that. They have to agree to teaching in a low-income poverty area, STEM type school, I believe for 4 years, and I believe you have 8 years to fulfill that requirement. If they do not fulfill that requirement, that $16,000 grant turns into an unsubsidized stafford loan, which is a loan that starts accruing interest. And the interest will be calculated based on when the student first received the TEACH grant. So it will be calculated and compounded over time. The Iraq and Afghanistan and Children of Fallen Award is those students that have served in the military or in public service and have died as a result of their duty. Then their students could be eligible for additional grant funding as well. The FAFSA also helps the schools to determine whether a student can get state aid or institutional aid, money that's awarded by the colleges. Some scholarships will require a copy of the student aid report, which is the results from the FAFSA application, to help determine eligibility for the scholarships. And that could be for private-based scholarships, scholarships that's offered by the schools, scholarships that's based on merit or talent, or simply just need-based scholarships. See, Denver has scholarships that we offer to our students through private agency as well as institutional. I put our website here for students to apply for those. Our priority deadline date for scholarships was March 1st, but we do have some scholarships that are still available that does not have the March 1st deadline date. So I encourage the students to go out and apply for those if they have not done so already. And then the FAFSA also determines the student's eligibility to receive work study, the federal work study, not student employment. The student can receive student employment, which is different from work study. Student employment is where they're basically hired by the university within a department to work. With federal work study, that's where the federal government is paying 75% of the student's income and the department pays 25%. So that's why it's very helpful and beneficial for colleges to be able to hire student employees because they can get help with some of that cost. But they need to request it on the FAFSA application. So there's a question on the FAFSA that says if you're interested, even if you don't know if you're going to work or not on campus, check yes. Therefore, it's awarded if you meet the eligibility criteria, because if you don't, and then later on you go to the financial aid office and you want to apply for a work study job, then you may have to go on a wait list because they over award the work study because they never know who's going to work and they have to spend that money. So it's better to go ahead and request it. If you're not interested in it, you can always just cancel it when you receive your award letter, or don't do anything with it in the financial aid office. Once they don't see that you're earning any income, they will go ahead and cancel that and start to award students on the wait list. Other type of financial aid that's awarded through the FAFSA are student loans. So even if you're not eligible for need-based aid, you still have to complete the FAFSA to be considered for federal student loans. So the student has a loan that's called the direct student loan. It comes in two different components, subsidized and unsubsidized. The subsidized portion means that the government is paying interest on that loan while the student is in school. On the unsubsidized portion, the interest starts accruing as soon as the funds are dispersed to the college. But in most cases, when you receive award notices, the aid and loans will be awarded through fall and spring semester. So aid is split in half, so only half of the money from any source will be awarded for the fall and will only disperse at the beginning of the fall term. Spring aid will not disperse until the beginning of the spring term in January. So if you have a loan and only half is dispersed, so only half, the interest is only accruing on half of that loan at that given time. With any federal loan, the student has to complete a master promissory note or an MPN, and also complete something called entrance counseling. It's like a little test that they have to take because they want to ensure that the student understands what they're signing up for, that they're applying for a loan, that it has to be repaid, what their responsibilities are, as well as what the lender's responsibility is to the student. And as of 2011, the U.S. Department of Education is the lender on any federal student loan, not a bank. They do hire a servicer once the student goes into repayment to help them service the loans and to answer any questions that the students may have, but the U.S. Department of Education will be the lender on any of those federal student loans. Okay? Repayment begins 6 months after graduation or the student ceases to be enrolled, at least half time or 6 credit hours. So if the student stops out of school and they're out more than 6 months before they graduate, they will go into repayment. If they decide to return to school and say 7, 8 months later, they have to continue to make those payments until they get their loan status back into a in-school deferred status. If they stop making the payments before that information is updated with their lender, they will go into default on that student loan. Going into default heavily damages your credit. So if there's any circumstances, reach out to the servicer, reach out to the financial aid office at the colleges, and they can assist you with that. And how the lenders register whether you're enrolled or not, the registrar's office at every college has to report your registration information. So they tell whether you're full-time, half-time, whether you graduated, whether you withdraw, you took a leave of absence. Every 60 days, that information is updated with the National Student Loan Database System. So then the parents are also eligible to receive a Parent Plus loan to take out on behalf of the student. FAFSA is required, even if the student doesn't receive any other aid. The FAFSA application is still required for the parents to receive the Parent Plus loan. They do have to complete the FAFSA application, regardless if your income is zero or if your income is $500,000 a year. You still have to provide that FAFSA application. Whereas the student's direct loan is not based on credit, the parent's application is based on credit. Where the student's application, once they submit it, is something called a serial note. It's good for 10 years. So they don't have to go through the NPN and entrance counseling every single year, but the parent does. So every time that a parent is interested in receiving funding to pay for their child's education, they will have to submit a new master promissory note and go through a credit check. So you want to be certain that you know the amount that you want to borrow. And if you borrow too much because you're not sure, you can always send the money back. There's no penalty for prepayment on any federal student loan. Okay? Payments can be deferred while the student's in school. If there's a denial based on credit, then there is a cosigner option. If the parent is denied the Parent Plus loan, then the student could be eligible for additional unsubsidized staff loan in the amount of $4,000. But if the student didn't receive any aid whatsoever, the parent could apply for a Parent Plus loan for the full cost of that student's attendance. So say, for instance, at a school, the cost of attendance is $25,000, and the student received $10,000 in financial aid. So there's $15,000 left over. That's the amount that the parent can apply for in the Parent Plus loan. You cannot apply for more aid than what the student's cost of attendance is, minus any other aid. So if the student didn't receive any other aid and the cost was $25,000, then the parent could apply for the Parent Plus loan in the amount of $25,000. So in order to receive federal student aid, there's certain criteria that has to be met. The student, not the parent, but the student has to be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, have a high school diploma or a GED, have a valid Social Security number or permanent resident number, must meet satisfactory academic progress. So that would be after the student has started college. At the end of each semester, their grades are looked at and evaluated. So there's 3 standards that the student has to meet at the end of each semester to continue to be eligible to receive federal student aid. So they have to maintain at least a 2.0 GPA. They have to be passing their classes at least 67% for that semester. So 67% of their courses for that term they have to pass. There's some colleges where they have a standard of 75%. So you have the 67% criteria for that eligibility for continued financial aid. And then the last standard is that the student has to be progressing towards graduation within 150% time frame. What that means is that for a typical undergraduate degree, it takes about 120 credits for a student to complete their degree. So for federal student aid purposes, it's giving them an additional 50%. So half of that 120 is 60. So for a total of 180 credits, the student can continue to take their classes and receive financial aid. So if they are still taking classes and they have 180 credits and they haven't graduated yet, their financial aid will be suspended If the financial aid is suspended, then they would have to appeal to the financial aid office to get additional funding. And most students that fall into that category is if they transfer from one school to another, and there's a lot of credits they transferred over, but the student changed their major, so they transferred in 60 credits, but they may have to take an additional 60 credits in order to finish. But that could put them over the 180 credits that they may have accumulated already. So they would have to appeal to the financial aid office. If they're just missing one semester or a year of credits, then the financial aid office may approve that, but only for the courses that they need in order to complete their degree, to sort of limit the amount of time that they're in school, because the goal is to graduate. And the sooner you graduate, less money it costs you overall. Okay. You do get 1 semester to have a OOPS semester, and you will go on probation for 1 semester, give you opportunity to get your grades up. If after that first semester, at the end of your second semester, you haven't done it and you don't meet that criteria again, then the student will be suspended and they have to appeal for financial aid to be continued. The financial aid office does not have to approve it. You will have to provide a personal statement as to what happened and what you're going to do to remedy that so it doesn't happen again. So all males that are born male must register for selective service between the ages of 18 and 25. Okay? And selective service is if there's a draft, they have to register for that. It hasn't been a draft in a long time, so I don't think we have to worry about that. But the student also has to be enrolled in accepted and an eligible program of study, meaning they're just not taking classes, but they're actually working towards completing a degree or a certificate program. And then lastly, once they've started school, they must not have had their eligibility suspended or terminated due to being convicted of a drug-related offense and also a sexual-related offense. You can have any other type of charge, but you cannot have a convicted drug-related offense or a sexual offender's offense. Otherwise, your financial aid will be suspended. So cost of attendance, we sort of talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the Parent Plus loan. So cost of attendance is basically an estimate of what the cost may be for a student during the fall and spring term to take classes, what their cost may be. And their budget or their cost of attendance consists of an estimate that's established by the colleges, the financial aid office at the college, and actually for Colorado, the state of Colorado is actually involved in some of those standards. So that cost of attendance or budget consists of tuition and fees, books, supplies, equipment, depending on the student's major and the courses that they're taking, room and board, which is housing or food, and that's room and board on campus, whether they're living on campus in their own apartment or if they're living at home with parents. There's an allowance in that cost of attendance for that. Transportation allowance to get to and fro, as well as an allowance for a personal expense. So personal expenses could be utility bills, especially if you're living on campus, clothing, toiletries, things of that nature. It's all included in the cost of attendance. So where a student may get a cost of attendance and it's $25,000 at that school and they're planning on living on campus. So usually the cost of attendance will budget out the most expensive cost at that school. So that means that it could be budgeted out as a single room and a full meal plan with 3 to 4 meals a day. It could be that that student wants to have 2 or 3 different roommates. So that could definitely decrease that housing cost. If they have a meal plan, instead of having 3 or 4 meals a day, if they go home on the weekends, or if they don't eat breakfast, then maybe they'll choose a meal plan that doesn't have a weekend plan, or just 2 meals a day since they don't do breakfast. So there's ways to sort of adjust those costs. So a cost of attendance is not a set actual cost for a student, it's just an estimate. It also depends on the type of classes that the students are taking, how many credits they're taking. Most schools will do a budget for 12 to 15 credits, but the students, if they're budgeted for 15, the student's only taking 12, then they will adjust that cost to accommodate what the student's actual cost is on that. So Cost of attendance could be a lot less than what's actually estimated, so the student may not need as much financial aid as it appears. Okay? The expected family contribution, again, is what the government considers families to be able to contribute towards the child's education. It's not always a realistic number, and that's where the loans sort of come into play. But they use that number that's generated by the information that you provide on the FAFSA to help determine how needy a student or a family is, and to determine what type of aid that can be awarded. Once the FAFSA is submitted, 3 to 5 days afterwards, the student will receive a student aid report, and it will look something like this. Here tells you what the student's EFC is. So again, if that number is below 5,900, then the student would be deemed some form of Pell eligibility. Pell eligibility is based on this number as well as the number of hours that they enrolled in. It will also tell you in the body of the letter what the EFC is. It will also tell you if the student's been selected for verification or not. Another indication if you've been selected for verification, you see this asterisk by the EFC. If there's an asterisk, then that students have been selected for verification, and the financial aid office will be reaching out to collect additional information. There's also something called a C code, which could be next to that EFC. You can have an asterisk and a C. But it's basically conflicting information on the FAFSA that the financial aid office will be reaching out to you to clear up whatever that discrepancy is. If you're selected for verification or there's a discrepancy on the FAFSA data that was submitted, the financial aid process halts on your application. So until you provide the information that's being requested, nothing is happening on your file. They will not reevaluate or provide you with an official award letter. You might get an estimated award letter, but an estimated award letter is not an official award letter. So you will have to provide that documentation in order to receive an official award letter. If you do not, then your file is just sitting there waiting on that information to be received by the financial aid office. Okay. Again, the student aid report, after you submit the FAFSA, 3 to 5 business days. The student will receive it electronically. If you mail it, 4 to 6 weeks. That's what the financial aid office will use to help determine how much aid a student can receive. So once you submit the FAFSA, it's very important that you're monitoring your email account that will be assigned by the colleges and also the student portal, because if anything's missing or if there's anything on the student's to-do list, then it will be provided in the CU Denver, not CU Denver, but just the college email and CU Denver email, as well as the student portal. If they're requesting any information, then they will instruct you to go to the portal to find out what that is, to give you an idea of what you need to submit in order to complete your file. Again, no award will be given until that has been submitted and completed. If we get additional scholarship money in, they may send out a mass email to all students. So that's why it's very important to monitor your college emails. Students should not put their high school emails on the FAFSA because they will not always have access to that high school email account. So create a personal, and then once they get their college, they want to use their college email address. And monitor that daily or at least once weekly for any updates, requests, notifications about additional funding that could be available. So this is just information if they're selected for verification, the type of information that could be requested. If it's a C code or discrepancy information, this is the type of information that could create a discrepancy on the FAFSA, meaning if there's a discrepancy, then the FAFSA is rejected, and that has to be fixed before the financial aid office can process. If you have a C code, that means your file is rejected and it's invalid. So that's all the information that I have. This is my contact information. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be happy to assist you. I'm available daily from 1 to 2 at this same link. So if you have questions and you just want to pop in, feel free to do that as well. So I'm going to stop sharing. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to address any of those questions. So Daniela, where is CU Denver? Do we turn in our FAFSA report? I'm not sure I understand that question. So you would complete the Fafsa application is the fafsa.ed.gov. The Caspa application, do put your email in the chat. We can send out that information to you, or you can go on to the state of Colorado website and just Google Caspa, Colorado application for state financial aid, and that can pull up that information. Oh, okay. So what they mean is that they completed the FAFSA, but they did not include a college on the FAFSA application. So again, you can add up to 10 different schools to receive your FAFSA data. So you would go to the FAFSA, just do a correction on the FAFSA, go down to the school section, and then just add the college. You can do a drop down, and put in the state of Colorado, and it'll list all the colleges in the state of Colorado. You can only put up to 10 different schools. If you already have 10 schools and you want to add another one, you have to take one of those schools off. So you need to make a decision about what your college choice is. Okay? And then add that school, resubmit it. Make sure that when you submit a correction on your FAFSA data, that you are signing with your FSA ID. The student and the parent should both use their FSA ID. If you're updating parent information and the student submits it with just their FSA ID, it will reject. It'll just sit there waiting for the parent to sign off on the information as well. Okay. Then make sure that you submit. You have to resubmit in order for the college to receive it. Okay. Are there any questions? If so, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can put it in the chat. Okay. And I'm going to stop recording.